For 15 years, the most feared man in Chicago believed the woman cleaning his penthouse was invisible. Park Jae-ho ran his empire with mathematical precision. Investigators described him as disciplined, patient, and terrifyingly intelligent, someone who treated crime like a science experiment. They believed his IQ was close to 160. In 3 decades, the FBI had investigated him repeatedly, but they never managed to prove a single murder, except for one case that never stopped haunting them. In 1998, a 12-year-old girl vanished after her father refused to cooperate with Jae-ho's organization. The only clue investigators ever recovered was a high-end Korean cigarette filter found near the scene. The case went cold within months. Nobody, no witnesses, no evidence that could stand in court. For 20 years, detectives believed Park Jae-ho had committed the perfect crime. What they didn't realize was that someone inside his own penthouse had been quietly studying him the entire time. Long before the FBI ever learned the name Park Jae-ho, the people who worked around him already understood something about the man. Park did not believe in chaos. He believed in control. Every morning at exactly 6 o'clock, the lights in his penthouse overlooking Lake Michigan turned on. Not 6:01, not 5:59. 6. His assistants knew better than to arrive late, and his drivers knew better than to ask unnecessary questions. Park had built his reputation on something unusual for a crime boss: precision. Where other men relied on violence and fear, Park relied on discipline. Former associates later told investigators that he treated every operation the same way a surgeon treats a procedure: carefully planned, emotionally detached, and finished without leaving anything behind. That philosophy was the reason the FBI had been chasing him for more than 30 years. And losing. Agents suspected Park in a string of disappearances across Illinois and Indiana. Rivals who had threatened his territory vanished. Informants stopped returning calls. One small-time money runner simply walked out of a bar one night and was never seen again. But every time investigators followed the trail, it ended the same way. Nothing. No witnesses. No weapons. No traceable financial movement. No evidence that could survive in court. One retired agent would later describe Park's criminal record with a single sentence. Everyone knew he was responsible, the agent said. But knowing something and proving it are two completely different things. There was only one case that ever came close to breaking that pattern. It happened in the summer of 1998. The victim wasn't a gangster. She wasn't an informant. She wasn't even an adult. She was 12 years old. Her nickname in the neighborhood was Little Bird, a quiet girl who spent most afternoons helping her father run a small bookkeeping office in Chicago's West Ridge neighborhood. Her father had one dangerous problem. He handled money for people connected to Park Jae-ho. At first, investigators believed the man had simply skimmed too much cash. But when federal agents finally interviewed him, they discovered something worse. The accountant had started asking questions. And in Park's world, questions could be fatal. 2 weeks later, the girl disappeared while walking home from a convenience store. There were no witnesses. No signs of a struggle. There was only one strange detail investigators couldn't explain. Lying near the edge of the sidewalk was a Korean cigarette filter, a rare brand imported privately from Seoul. Detectives traced the brand through specialty distributors in Chicago. Only a handful of people bought them regularly. One of them was Park Jae-ho, but that clue alone wasn't enough to bring him in. Without a body, without a witness, and without a direct link between Park and the scene, prosecutors refused to file charges. Within 6 months, the investigation stalled. Within a year, the case was moved into cold storage. For the next 2 decades, the disappearance of Little Bird became just another unanswered file in Chicago's archives. Park Jae-ho's empire continued to grow. His reputation continued to spread. And in the quiet penthouse above the city, the man detectives could never touch lived his life exactly the way he preferred. What Park never realized was that someone inside that penthouse had already begun noticing things the FBI had missed. And unlike the detectives chasing him from the outside, she was watching from inside the walls. The first thing people noticed about Cassie was how quiet she was. Quiet in a way that made people forget she was in the room. That was exactly why Park Jae-ho hired her. In Park's world, visibility was dangerous. The people who worked around him were either fiercely loyal, highly paid, or carefully watched. But domestic staff fell into a different category altogether. They were background. Furniture that moved. Cassie had started working in the penthouse 15 years earlier through a private staffing agency that specialized in high-security households. Her file described her in simple terms: reliable, punctual, and discreet. She had worked for diplomats, executives, and one retired judge. Nothing remarkable, which was precisely what Park wanted. When he interviewed her, he asked only 3 questions. Do you talk about your employers? No, sir. Do you bring visitors into the home? No, sir. Do you follow instructions? Yes, sir. Park nodded once and hired her on the spot. To him, Cassie represented something useful: invisibility. She was a middle-aged black woman with a soft voice and careful manners, someone who, in Park's mind, existed outside the circles that mattered to him. She wasn't part of the Korean community he trusted, and she certainly wasn't connected to law enforcement. That meant she had no reason to care about his business. Or so he believed. Cassie worked 2 days a week, Mondays and Thursdays. She arrived at 8 in the morning and left before the afternoon security shift changed. Her routine rarely varied. Kitchen first, then the study, then the bedrooms. Finally, the long hallway that led to Park's private office and the narrow balcony overlooking Lake Michigan. Over time, Cassie learned something detectives had never managed to understand about Park Jae-ho. He was obsessed with order. Not just cleanliness. Order. Every object in the penthouse had a position. Every drawer had a system. Park even aligned his shoes in the closet with the toes pointing in the exact same direction. At first, Cassie thought the habit was simply a personality trait. But the longer she worked there, the more she noticed how deeply it controlled him. If a chair was slightly out of place, if a book was returned to the shelf in the wrong order, or if the marble counter still carried a faint smudge after cleaning, Park noticed. He noticed everything, except for the one thing that mattered. Because while Park watched for mistakes in his environment, Cassie had quietly started paying attention to something else. Patterns. She noticed which phone calls made him leave the room. She noticed which visitors arrived late at night. She noticed which trash bags he tied himself instead of leaving for the cleaning staff. Most importantly, she noticed the things Park threw away when he believed no one important was watching. At first, Cassie didn't understand why those details mattered. But one evening, nearly 3 years into the job, something appeared in the trash that made her stop. It was small, plastic, easy to overlook. The kind of object someone might throw away without thinking twice. A used inhaler. And when Cassie picked it up, she noticed something else that detectives never had. The brand name is printed on its side. It was the same brand mentioned in an old newspaper clipping she had kept folded inside a drawer at home. A clipping about a girl who had vanished 20 years earlier. A girl the newspapers had once called Little Bird. Cassie did not report the inhaler. That would have been the normal thing to do. Most people, if they suspected something connected to a crime, would have called the police immediately. But Cassie understood something that investigators often struggled with when dealing with men like Park Jae-ho. Evidence meant nothing if the man who created it never made a mistake. And Park Jae-ho did not make mistakes. For years, federal agents had tried to break his circle by applying pressure. They questioned associates, searched financial records, monitored his calls, and even placed surveillance outside his building. Every attempt ended the same way. Park stayed silent. Cassie understood that if the inhaler truly connected Park to the 1998 disappearance, then simply turning it over to investigators would accomplish very little. The lawyers surrounding men like Park were experts at dismantling incomplete evidence. What she needed was something stronger, something only the killer would know. And the only way to get that was the same way detectives would have approached it. Conversation. Not accusations. Not threats. Just questions that sounded harmless enough to answer. Cassie began slowly. One Monday morning, while wiping the marble kitchen counter, she spoke casually without looking up. Mr. Park, I saw something on the news yesterday. Park was sitting at the breakfast table reviewing documents on his tablet. Without lifting his eyes, he responded in the same calm voice he used with everyone. What kind of news? Cassie shrugged slightly. They were talking about an old missing person case. A girl from Chicago many years ago. Park's fingers stopped moving across the tablet screen. For a moment, he said nothing. Then he took a slow sip of tea. People disappear every day, he said finally. That is not news. Cassie nodded politely and continued cleaning. Yes, sir. But they said the police might reopen the investigation because of new DNA technology. Park looked up then. Not sharply, not nervously, just long enough to study her. Technology makes detectives lazy, he said. They believe machines solve problems instead of intelligence. Cassie smiled faintly. My nephew says the same thing about computers, she said. Park leaned back in his chair. He enjoyed discussions about intelligence. In fact, people who worked around him knew something about Park Jae-ho that detectives had also noticed over the years. His greatest weakness was not anger. It was pride. Park believed he was smarter than everyone around him. And people who believe that often make the same mistake. They start explaining things no one asked them to explain. You know what detectives misunderstand about crime? Park said, folding his hands together. Cassie shook her head gently. No, sir. They assume criminals panic, Park continued. They assume violence happens in chaos. But the best operations are controlled, planned, clean. Cassie kept wiping the counter slowly. Clean, she repeated softly. Park nodded. Exactly. If someone were intelligent enough, they could remove every trace of what happened. Cassie paused for half a second. Then she asked the smallest question of the morning. How would someone do that? Park smiled slightly. And for the first time in 20 years, the man the detectives believed had committed the perfect crime began explaining how perfection works. Park Jae-ho had spent most of his life around dangerous men, gangsters, smugglers, and businessmen who treated loyalty the way surgeons treat gloves, something disposable when the situation demanded it. Over the years, he had learned to recognize fear in others. He had also learned something else. Most people stopped talking when they felt threatened. Park did the opposite. When he believed he was the smartest person in the room, he liked to explain things. That morning in the kitchen, Cassie had asked a simple question. How would someone remove every trace? Park rested his elbow on the table and studied her for a moment. To him, the conversation felt harmless. Cassie had worked in the penthouse for years. She rarely asked questions, and when she did, they were usually about laundry schedules or pantry supplies. But now she was asking about crime. The subject interested him. People imagine violence is messy, Park said, tapping the side of his teacup. They think emotion leads the process. But emotion is what makes criminals careless. Cassie continued wiping the marble counter, her movements slow and unremarkable. So careful people do it differently? She asked. Park nodded. Careful people prepare. He gestured slightly with his hand, as if outlining steps on an invisible board. First, control the environment. No witnesses. No cameras. No interruptions. Cassie nodded as if listening to a lecture. And then, she asked. Park leaned back in his chair. Then you eliminate the evidence. He spoke the words calmly, almost academically. Blood, fibers, biological material. All of it leaves traces. But there are methods to neutralize those traces. Cassie tilted her head slightly. Cleaning chemicals? Park smiled faintly. Household chemicals are useless, he said. Detectives know how to detect bleach. They know how to analyze detergents. He paused. Then his voice lowered slightly, as though he were sharing a professional secret. If someone were intelligent, they would use something stronger. Cassie didn't speak. She simply waited. Park continued. Industrial lye, he said. Powerful enough to dissolve organic material if applied correctly. Cassie nodded thoughtfully, as though trying to remember the name. Lye, she repeated quietly. Park watched her for a moment. Then he smiled again. You wouldn't understand the chemistry, he said. But the principle is simple. Destroy the evidence before anyone knows there was evidence. Cassie resumed wiping the counter. For the next several seconds, neither of them spoke. Then she asked another small question. And the police never find anything? Park shook his head slowly. Not if the person knows what they're doing. He stood up from the table and carried his empty teacup to the sink. You see, Cassie, detectives rely on mistakes. They believe every criminal makes one. He placed the cup gently beside the faucet. But some people are disciplined enough not to. Cassie looked up briefly. Yes, sir, she said. Park left the kitchen and disappeared down the hallway toward his private office. The moment he was gone, Cassie stopped cleaning. She stood very still for several seconds. Because something Park had just said was more important than he realized. When detectives investigated the disappearance of the girl in 1998, they had never released details about chemical evidence. The word lye had never appeared in a single police report or press conference. That detail had been known only to investigators and to the person who used it. Cassie set the cloth down slowly. For 20 years, Park Jae-ho had managed to avoid every trap detectives placed in his path. But that morning, while explaining how intelligent criminals remove evidence, he had finally said something only the killer could know. And Park Jae-ho still believed he was the smartest person in the room. For most of his life, Park Jae-ho had survived by understanding one simple rule: never leave proof behind. That rule had protected him for more than 30 years. It was the reason investigators chasing his name always ended up standing in empty rooms, holding theories instead of evidence. But Park had another rule, and that one was far more dangerous. Park believed he could control every environment he entered: the penthouse, the businesses, the people around him, especially the quiet woman who cleaned the floors. After the conversation in the kitchen, Cassie finished her work the way she always did, methodically and without drawing attention. She vacuumed the hallway, dusted the bookshelves, and replaced the cleaning supplies inside the small utility closet near the elevator. To anyone watching, nothing had changed. But inside her mind, the entire house had shifted. Because Park had just done something detectives had been trying to make him do for decades. He had volunteered information. Not a confession, not even a direct admission, but something just as powerful. A detail that had never been released to the public. Industrial lie. Cassie understood immediately what that meant. If Park knew about the chemical used in the original investigation, then he knew more about that crime scene than any innocent person should. But a single suspicious statement was not enough to destroy a man like Park Jae-ho. People like him were surrounded by lawyers who specialized in dismantling assumptions. Without physical evidence to support the suspicion, Park could simply say he had read the information somewhere, or heard it from someone, or guessed. Cassie needed something stronger, something that would tie Park directly to the past. That was when she remembered the inhaler. It had been sitting quietly in a small metal container inside her apartment for nearly 12 years. She had found it by accident. Nearly a decade earlier, Park had ordered her to clear out several old suits from a garment bag in the back of his walk-in closet. The instructions were simple: throw them away. When Cassie checked the lining of one of the jackets, something small slipped out and rolled across the floor. A plastic inhaler. Used. At the time, she thought it was simply something forgotten in a pocket. But the brand name had stopped her. It was the exact same inhaler mentioned in a newspaper article she had read many years earlier about the missing girl. The article described how the child had suffered from asthma. Cassie had quietly taken the inhaler home instead of discarding it. She never told anyone. For years it sat untouched. Because Cassie knew something most people didn't. Evidence only matters when the right moment arrives. And until Park made a mistake, the inhaler meant nothing. But now that mistake had happened. Cassie finished packing her cleaning supplies and moved toward the elevator. Before leaving, she followed one last routine she had practiced for years. She emptied the trash. Inside Park's private office, the waste bin contained shredded documents, used tea packets, and a few cigarette filters. Cassie tied the bag and lifted it out. That was when she heard footsteps behind her. Park's voice appeared suddenly in the doorway. "Cassie." She froze. Park stood there watching her. His expression wasn't angry, but it was observant. And observant men notice details. "What are you doing in my office?" he asked calmly. Cassie lifted the trash bag slightly. "Emptying the bin, sir." Park stepped into the room. For a moment, neither of them moved. He studied her face the same way a chess player studies a board after an unexpected move. Then his eyes drifted down to the trash bag in her hands. And something about the silence in the room changed. Because for the first time in 15 years, Park Jae-ho was looking at Cassie like she might actually matter. For 15 years, Park Jae-ho had never paid much attention to the woman cleaning his home. Cassie moved quietly through the penthouse the way shadows move across a wall, present, but rarely noticed. She vacuumed the carpets, wiped the marble counters, and replaced the trash bags without speaking unless spoken to. That invisibility had always been part of the design. Park preferred people who understood their place. But something about the moment in his office had disturbed the balance. Cassie was holding the trash bag. Standing inside a room she rarely entered unless necessary. And Park had learned long ago that unusual behavior often meant something had shifted. He watched her for a moment longer. "Leave the office," he said finally. Cassie nodded once. "Yes, sir." She walked past him slowly and placed the trash bag in the hallway cart where the other waste bags were waiting to be removed. Her movements were steady. Her breathing is calm. But inside her mind, every calculation was changing. Because Park had just done something she had hoped would never happen. He had started paying attention. Men like Park survived because they trusted patterns. When patterns broke, they investigated. And Cassie knew that if Park ever began asking the wrong questions, 15 years of quiet observation could collapse in minutes. She finished the rest of her cleaning routine carefully, avoiding the office entirely. When she finally stepped into the elevator and pressed the lobby button, she allowed herself one slow breath. The inhaler was still safe at her apartment. Park hadn't discovered it. But something else had changed. The game had become dangerous. Because now Park was thinking. Upstairs in the penthouse, Park stood in the doorway of his office for several minutes after Cassie left. At first, he told himself the feeling was nothing. Just a moment of irritation. But Park's instincts had kept him alive longer than most men in his profession. Instincts didn't exist without reason. He walked slowly to his desk and looked at the trash bin. Empty. Then he stepped to the window and stared out across the lake. The city below moved normally. Cars, lights, and people living lives that had nothing to do with him. But inside his mind, a small question had begun forming. It was not yet suspicion, just curiosity. Park replayed the morning conversation in his head. The missing girl. The mention of new DNA technology. The way Cassie had asked about cleaning chemicals. Most people would have forgotten the conversation within minutes. Park did not forget details. He remembered every word. Finally, he walked back toward the kitchen and opened a small cabinet near the sink. Inside were several containers of industrial cleaning supplies. Park studied them for a moment. Then he closed the cabinet again. His expression remained calm. But the thought lingered. Because for the first time in many years, something inside his perfectly ordered world felt slightly out of place. And when Park Jae-ho sensed something out of place, he started looking for the reason. What he didn't realize yet was that the person he was beginning to study had been studying him for 15 years. And the longer Park looked for answers, the closer he was getting to the trap Cassie had spent half her life preparing. Because the most dangerous moment in any investigation is the moment the suspect begins investigating back. For the next 2 weeks, nothing appeared to change inside Park Jae-ho's penthouse. Cassie arrived on Monday morning the same way she always did. The elevator opened. She stepped into the marble hallway. And Park's empire continued moving with the same quiet precision it had maintained for decades. But something inside the house had shifted. Park was watching now. Not openly. Park Jae-ho had not survived 30 years in organized crime by making his suspicions obvious. Instead, he observed the same way a chess player studies a board, slowly, patiently, waiting to see whether a pattern revealed itself. The first change Cassie noticed came 3 days later. The trash bags. Normally, Park tied them himself and left them in the same location every evening near the service hallway. It was one of those small habits Cassie had learned years earlier. But that Monday, the bag was gone. Not moved. Gone. Cassie stood in the kitchen for a moment, holding the empty liner in her hands. Then she continued cleaning as if nothing had happened. But inside her mind, a warning light had turned on. Park was testing something. Upstairs, Park stood near the window of his private office, watching the reflection of the kitchen through the polished glass wall behind him. He couldn't see Cassie clearly, but he could see enough. When she realized the trash had been removed earlier than usual, her hands paused for less than a second. Most people would never notice a pause that small. Park noticed. That pause meant Cassie had expected the trash to be there, which meant she had been paying attention to routines. And routines were something Park protected carefully. Later that afternoon, he opened the small service door near the elevator where the trash chute emptied into the building's disposal system. Inside the metal compartment were 3 tied bags. Park cut the first one open with a pocket knife. Coffee grounds. Paper towels. Nothing unusual. The second bag contained kitchen waste and empty tea packets. Again, nothing important. But the third bag was different. Inside were several cigarette filters. Park rarely smoked inside the penthouse. He preferred the balcony, which meant the cigarettes had been smoked somewhere else in the building, or by someone else entirely. Park studied the filters for a moment before dropping them back into the bag. Then he closed the compartment and returned to his office. For most men, the discovery would have meant nothing. But Park believed in eliminating every variable. And now Cassie had become a variable. Meanwhile, downstairs in the service elevator, Cassie placed her cleaning cart against the wall and pressed the lobby button. Her face remained calm. But the situation had changed again. Park was not only observing. He was beginning to investigate. And Cassie knew something most investigators learn the hard way. Once a suspect starts asking questions, the window for gathering evidence becomes dangerously small. Because intelligent criminals eventually reach the same conclusion. Someone inside the house knows something. Cassie stepped out of the elevator and crossed the lobby toward the street exit. The inhaler was still hidden safely in her apartment. But if Park continued tightening control inside the penthouse, retrieving that evidence might soon become impossible. For 15 years, she had waited for the right moment. Now she had to decide whether that moment had already arrived. Because the one thing Cassie understood about men like Park Jae-ho was that they did not tolerate uncertainty. Sooner or later, Park would demand answers. And when that happened, there would only be two possible outcomes. Either Cassie would prove what detectives had never been able to prove, or Park Jae-ho would remove the one person in his house who knew too much. By the following Thursday, the tension inside the penthouse had become almost invisible. But it was there. Cassie could feel it the moment the elevator doors opened. The apartment looked exactly the same as always. The marble counters were spotless, the blinds were aligned perfectly with the window frames, and the scent of green tea still lingered faintly in the air. Park Jae-ho was sitting at the long dining table reviewing documents. He didn't look up when she entered. "Good morning, sir," Cassie said. Park gave a small nod without lifting his eyes. "Good morning." To anyone watching, the moment looked ordinary. But Cassie noticed something immediately. Park had moved his chair. Only a few inches. But for a man obsessed with precision, a few inches meant something. The chair was positioned so he could see the reflection of the hallway behind him in the polished surface of the dining table, which meant he could watch Cassie without turning around. Park was testing her. Cassie understood that now. So she did exactly what she had done for 15 years. She cleaned. Kitchen counters first. Then the living room shelves. Then the long hallway that led to Park's private office. Every movement was slow and careful. The kind of movement someone makes when they believe no one is paying attention. But Park was paying attention to everything. And that was exactly what Cassie needed. Because the trap she had been building did not rely on secrecy anymore. It relied on Park's ego. While she wiped the glass table near the balcony doors, Cassie spoke again. Softly, casually. "Mr. Park, they mentioned something else about that old case on the news yesterday." Park's eyes lifted from his tablet. "Which case?" "The missing girl," Cassie said. "They said the detectives believe the killer tried to destroy evidence." Park leaned back slightly. "They believe many things," he said. Cassie nodded. "They mentioned chemicals again." Park's lips tightened slightly. "Detectives like dramatic theories," he said. Cassie tilted her head as if thinking. "They said something about the chemicals not working perfectly," she added. "That sometimes traces still remain." For a moment, Park said nothing. Then he laughed. A quiet, dismissive laugh. "That is because they don't understand chemistry," he said. Cassie kept cleaning the glass. "What do they misunderstand?" Park stood up from the table and walked toward the balcony window. When he spoke again, his voice carried the tone of someone correcting a student. "They misunderstand timing," he said. Cassie waited. Park turned slightly toward her. "If lie is applied correctly and given enough time, there is nothing left to find," he said calmly. The room fell quiet again. Cassie nodded slowly. "I see." Park studied her for a moment longer before turning away. He believed the conversation had ended. But Cassie had already heard what she needed. Because detectives investigating the 1998 disappearance had never publicly confirmed that chemicals were used at all. That information had been kept inside sealed case files. Yet Park had just corrected her again. Not about whether chemicals were used, but about how they worked. Cassie finished wiping the table and placed the cloth back in her cleaning cart. Then she moved down the hallway toward the utility closet. Inside the cart, hidden beneath folded rags and cleaning supplies, her phone rested quietly in a small compartment. She removed it and typed a short message. 3 words. He confirmed it. The message went to a number that had been waiting for 15 years. Because the truth about Park Jae-ho's perfect crime had never been completely buried. It had simply been waiting for the right moment to surface. And that moment had just arrived. What Park didn't know was that the next time Cassie entered the penthouse, she would not be coming alone. For the rest of that day, Park Jae-ho told himself the conversation meant nothing. Cassie had asked a question. He had answered it. That was all. Yet long after she left the penthouse that afternoon, the conversation replayed quietly in the back of his mind. Park had learned many things during his years running the Chicago outfit, but one lesson had stayed with him longer than any other. Danger rarely arrived loudly. It arrived quietly, in small details. And Cassie had asked too many small questions. Park sat alone in the living room that evening, watching the skyline darken beyond the glass walls of the penthouse. The city lights slowly replaced the fading sunlight over Lake Michigan. Normally, he found the view calming, but tonight something about the silence felt different. Park reached for a cigarette and stepped out onto the balcony. The wind off the lake carried the faint smell of rain. He lit the cigarette and took a slow drag. Then another thought surfaced. The inhaler. For years he had believed he had destroyed every trace connected to the 1998 incident. The body had been handled. The scene had been cleaned. The clothing had been burned. Everything had been removed with the same discipline he applied to every operation. Yet something about Cassie's questions stirred an old memory, a moment he had not thought about in decades. During the struggle in the garage, his chest had tightened. He had reached for the inhaler in his coat pocket, used it once, then dropped it. Park exhaled slowly into the cold air. He had always believed the inhaler had been destroyed with the rest of the clothing. But memory was a strange thing. It didn't always stay where you left it. Park finished the cigarette and stepped back inside. For the first time in many years, he walked into the walk-in closet and began examining the back wall where old garment bags had once been stored. Most of them were gone, discarded years earlier, but a single empty hanger remained. Park stared at it for a long moment. Then something else began to settle into place. Cassie had been working in the penthouse for 15 years. Long enough to clean that closet dozens of times. Long enough to remove the clothing that had once been stored there. Long enough to find something that didn't belong. Park's breathing slowed. The idea felt unlikely. But Park Jae-ho did not believe in ignoring unlikely things. He believed in eliminating them. The next morning, he called his security director. "Run a background check on the cleaning staff," Park said. "Anything specific?" the man asked. "Yes." Park's voice remained calm. "The woman named Cassie." There was a pause on the other end of the line. "She's been working here for years," the director said. "Agency verified." "Verify it again." Park ended the call and placed the phone down on the table. For 15 years, he had believed Cassie was invisible. But invisibility was only safe when no one looked directly at it. Now Park was looking. And once Park began looking for answers, he rarely stopped until he found them. What he didn't know yet was that Cassie had already prepared for that moment. Because 15 years earlier, when she first stepped into Park Jae-ho's penthouse with a mop and a cleaning cart, she had not arrived as a maid. She had arrived as something far more dangerous. A witness who had come to finish what the detectives never could. And by the time Park finished investigating her past, the people investigating Park Jae-ho would already be on their way upstairs. The background check came back faster than Park expected. By mid-afternoon the next day, his security director called. "There's something strange," the man said. Park was sitting in his office overlooking the lake, reading a financial report he no longer cared about. "What kind of strange?" Park asked. The director hesitated. "Her records are clean," he said. Park leaned back in his chair. "Explain." "Cassie Johnson," the director said, reading from his screen. "Born in Indiana. No arrests. No credit issues. No family disputes. 15 years of employment history that checks out." "That sounds normal," Park said. "It should," the director replied. "But nobody has a life that quiet." Park's fingers tapped once against the desk. "What about relatives?" "That's the strange part," the director said. "There used to be one." Park waited. "A younger sister," the director continued. "Disappeared in 1998. The room went still. Park's eyes slowly lifted from the desk. "Disappeared where?" "Outside Chicago," the director said. "In a neighborhood that used to belong to the Valo organization before your group absorbed it." Park's breathing slowed. "What was her name?" The director paused before answering. "Lena Johnson." The sound of the name moved through the room like a cold wind. Because Park Jae-ho remembered that name. He remembered the night, the alley, the sudden struggle that escalated too quickly, the moment when a small voice screamed louder than expected. Park had not known the girl's family name at the time, but the case had been whispered about for years afterward. The little bird. The nickname detectives had given the missing girl. Park ended the call without another word. For several seconds, he sat perfectly still. Then he stood and walked slowly into the hallway. Cassie was in the kitchen, cleaning the stainless steel counter, the same way she always did. But Park was no longer seeing her the way he had before. Now he was seeing patterns, timing, questions. 15 years of silence that suddenly looked less like obedience and more like patience. Park stepped into the kitchen. Cassie looked up. Yes, sir. Park studied her face. 15 years. And he had never once truly looked at her. Not really. What was your sister's name? Park asked suddenly. Cassie froze. Only for a fraction of a second. But Park saw it. The smallest crack in the surface. Then she lowered her eyes. Lena, she said softly. Park's chest tightened. You never told me you had a sister, he said. Cassie returned to wiping the counter. She died a long time ago, she replied. Park stepped closer. How? Cassie stopped cleaning. Then she slowly turned to face him. For the first time in 15 years, Cassie looked directly into Park Jae-ho's eyes. She disappeared, she said. Park's pulse thudded once in his ears. Did they ever find her? He asked. Cassie's expression didn't change. No, she said. Park searched her face for something. Anger, hatred, or accusation. But there was none. Why did you come to work here? Park asked quietly. Cassie considered the question. Then she answered. Because this building pays well. Park held her gaze for another long moment. Then he nodded. Of course. He turned and walked back toward his office. But the air inside the penthouse had changed completely. Park knew now. Not everything. But enough. Cassie Johnson had not arrived by accident. She had come looking for something. And if Park Jae-ho had learned anything in 30 years of surviving the criminal world, it was that people who waited that long were rarely looking for money. They were looking for justice. Inside the cleaning cart near the kitchen door, Cassie's phone vibrated once. A single message appeared on the screen. FBI unit in position. Cassie closed her eyes for a brief moment. 15 years of silence had brought her to this day. And upstairs in the penthouse, the man who believed he was untouchable had finally started asking the right questions. The problem for Park Jae-ho was that he had asked them too late, because the elevator was already moving. And this time, it wasn't bringing another cleaning crew. It was bringing the end of Park Jae-ho's perfect silence. Park Jae-ho had survived for 3 decades by trusting one rule. When a situation changes, you move first. He returned to his office and closed the door quietly. The skyline outside the window was glowing with late afternoon light, but Park was no longer looking at the view. He was thinking. Cassie Johnson. Lena Johnson. 15 years. The pieces of the puzzle had shifted, but Park's instincts were still sharp. And one instinct now whispered the same warning over and over again. You waited too long. Park opened the bottom drawer of his desk and removed a small black pistol. He checked the chamber, slid the weapon back into the drawer, and closed it halfway. Within reach. Then he stood and walked back into the living room. Cassie was still cleaning the kitchen, but something else had changed. Park could hear it. A faint mechanical sound from the hallway. The elevator. It was rising. Normally that sound meant nothing. Cleaning staff. Food delivery. Maintenance. But today Park was listening more carefully, because the elevator had stopped at the private penthouse level, and he hadn't called for anyone. Park walked toward the kitchen slowly. Cassie was wiping the counter with the same quiet rhythm she had used every day for 15 years. But when she saw Park approaching, she stopped. Is something wrong, sir? She asked. Park studied her. Then he smiled. Tell me something, Cassie, he said. When did you realize it was me? Cassie didn't answer immediately. Then she placed the cloth down on the counter. About 12 years ago, she said. Park raised an eyebrow. 12. Cassie nodded. That was when I found the coat. Park's stomach tightened. The tuxedo you threw away, she continued. You thought it was burned. Park said nothing. Cassie's voice remained calm. But you never checked the inside lining. Park slowly exhaled. The inhaler, he said. Cassie nodded once. Park let out a quiet laugh. 15 years, he said softly. All this time you were standing in my house with the evidence. Cassie didn't correct him, because the truth was more complicated. The inhaler had been stored in a safe place years ago. But what Park didn't know was that Cassie had already handed the evidence over. Months earlier, Park walked slowly toward the balcony window. You know something interesting? Park said quietly. I always wondered if someone would eventually come looking, he said. He turned back toward her. But I never thought it would be the maid. Cassie's voice remained steady. You never looked at the maid. He nodded. That's true. Then a voice, very loud. Federal agents. Open the door. The room went silent. Park looked toward the entrance. then back toward Cassie. For the first time since she had entered the penthouse 15 years ago, Park saw her clearly, not as staff, but as the person who had waited longer than anyone else. "You planned this well," Park said. Cassie didn't respond. "Mr. Park, this is the FBI." Park walked slowly back toward his office. For a moment, Cassie wondered if he might reach for the gun. Instead, he simply stopped in the doorway. "You know," Cassie said quietly, "I always believed the police would eventually find my sister's killer." Cassie's voice was calm. "They didn't." Park nodded. "No." Then he looked back at her one final time. "You did." A loud knock echoed through the penthouse, and the door was pushed open. Cassie walked toward the entrance. For 15 years, she had imagined what this moment would feel like. Anger, relief, closure. But the feeling that finally settled over her was something quieter. Completion. 6 federal agents in dark jackets marked FBI were inside. Behind them, 2 Chicago detectives who had worked the 1998 disappearance case stood watching with the quiet patience of men who had waited most of their careers for this moment. For a second, no one moved. Cassie stepped aside. The agents entered. "Park Jae-ho," the lead agent said, his voice firm but controlled. "You are under arrest for the murder of Lena Johnson and related criminal charges connected to the concealment of evidence." Park stood near the office doorway, hands at his sides. He did not reach for the desk drawer. He did not run. He looked past the agents and focused on Cassie. "So this is how it ends," he said quietly. The lead agent stepped forward and read the formal rights. "You have the right to remain silent." But Park was barely listening. His attention stayed on Cassie. For 15 years, he had believed the quiet woman moving through his penthouse was background noise. Now she stood in the center of the room like the final move in a chess game he hadn't realized he was playing. "You waited a long time," Park said. "That kind of patience," he said softly, "is rare." One of the agents stepped behind him and secured his wrists with handcuffs. For the first time in 30 years, Park Jae-ho was physically restrained. The empire that had operated in silence for decades had just been broken by the one person he never thought to watch. As the agents guided him toward the door, Park stopped walking. He turned slightly toward Cassie again. "Tell me something," he said. "When you first came here, did you already know?" Cassie considered the question. Then she answered honestly. "No." Park raised an eyebrow. "I suspected," she continued. "But suspicion isn't truth." Park nodded slowly. Cassie looked around the penthouse. The polished surfaces she had wiped thousands of times. "I stayed until the truth had somewhere to stand," she said. Park held her gaze for a moment longer. Then he nodded again. "You did well," he said. The agents guided him toward the elevator. Just before stepping inside, Park turned one final time. "Cassie." She looked up. "You cleaned my house for 15 years, he said. Cassie didn't answer. Park's voice softened slightly. "But you were never really cleaning the house, were you?" Cassie shook her head. "No." The elevator doors closed. And just like that, Park Jae-ho was gone. The case that followed stunned Chicago. For decades, investigators had chased rumors about Park Jae-ho's operations. But rumors were never enough. Now they had something else. Evidence. The inhaler recovered years earlier still contained trace DNA that matched both Park's and the victim's blood. Cassie's testimony explained how she had found it, how she had preserved it, and how she had spent 15 years documenting every small detail of the man who believed himself untouchable. Prosecutors built their case around one simple narrative. Park Jae-ho's greatest weakness had not been violence. It had been arrogance. He believed no one around him was intelligent enough to see him clearly, especially the woman holding the broom. The jury deliberated for less than 6 hours. Park Jae-ho was convicted of murder. He received life without parole. 6 months later, Cassie stood outside the same penthouse building one last time. The apartment had been seized by federal authorities and emptied during the investigation. The windows that once looked out across Lake Michigan were dark, silent. For years, that building had been the center of Park's empire. Now it was just another structure in a city full of them. Cassie turned and began walking toward the street. Sometimes justice doesn't arrive through raids or interrogations. Sometimes it arrives quietly, in the form of someone who watches, someone who waits, someone willing to spend the time collecting the truth hidden in the trash. Because the most dangerous person in a criminal's life is the one they believe is just ordinary. And Park Jae-ho had made that mistake for 15 years, until the maid finally stopped cleaning and started speaking. In the end, Park Jae-ho didn't fall because of a raid, a gun, or a mistake in his empire. He fell because he underestimated the quiet person cleaning his house. Cassie proved that patience can be sharper than power and that truth doesn't always arrive loudly. Sometimes it waits. For more stories like this, kindly subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss the next story.